So let's talk about anti-feminism today. What is anti-feminism anyway? This is a question that I wish I were asked more often. Some of the time people will tell me what it is and are wrong. Most of the time, in my experience at least, not even that. Those who attack my beliefs tend to do so based on wild assumptions and an inaccurate perception of what it is that I stand for. And I know this is the reality for many of my anti-feminist friends and colleagues. By those attempting to be more polite, I'm often told condescendingly, well, you're just really extreme. You're just kind of extreme. And I will often then ask, what it is that I've said that's extreme. Or I'll ask what this person's knowledge is of feminism, what their education is on feminist history or current feminist theory or anti-feminism, to which I usually receive stammers or silence or an admission that they haven't actually studied or looked into this topic at all. Now, I do not expect everyone to have studied this. People have lives, and not everyone's lives are involved in this arena. So don't get me wrong there. But here's the thing. How can you credibly tell someone that they're extreme or overreacting when you actually have no idea what they're reacting to? This is obviously an exaggerated or extreme analogy, but bear with me. If you were unaware that during World War II, Nazis had concentration camps and were exterminating millions and millions of people, then you might think that going to war with them was an extreme or unwarranted reaction, right? If you were unaware of the full context and you were unaware of the circumstances, then your judgments on the response given by the Allies, for example, might be off, right? So this is definitely my thought on anti-feminism. The men's rights movement, and to a lesser extent, anti-feminism, looks extreme to our culture at present only because we are a feminist culture. Likewise, those who opposed racism and stood for the rights of blacks in particular looked extreme at one time in our country because we were very racist as a culture. It only looks like a ridiculous comparison now because most have come to see racism, toward blacks at least, as the evil that it is, but many have yet to come to see sexism and discrimination and misandry toward men as the evil that it is. I and many anti-feminists take the stance that we oppose feminism and stand for human rights instead. And if we say that, the response is often, you hate women. You must oppose women. And that's as absurd as saying, well, you oppose racism and you stand for civil rights. Therefore, you must oppose white people. Not necessarily. First, this really exposes the fact that feminists seem unable to think in anything other than zero-sum terms, right? So this is not a zero-sum game. The losses of men are not gains for women and vice versa. We are quite literally all in this together in this world. But second, feminism is not women. It's an ism. It's a specific ideology, right? It claims to exist for the purpose of truly equal rights for women, which in and of itself isn't a coherent claim. You can't have equality for women. It's equality between men and women, or it's nothing, you know what I'm saying? Or it's privilege for women. But be that as it may, it claims to exist for the purpose of equality, but anyone would be foolhardy to ignorantly assume that it does just because that's its claim, right? That's not very logical. A statement like that deserves examination and critical thought, does it not? Now, feminism is many things, and its tentacles reach far and wide throughout our country and the world. I'm not going to get into it in this video about why it really isn't about equality, and frankly was never about equality. At the very least, we should be able to agree that it isn't about equality now, but I would take the stance that it never has been. And the more I learn and the more I read about in history, I see that that's the case. But for some people, or for some reason, people seem to have a hard time grasping the notion that that anti-feminism is not anti-women. I personally see anti-feminism as a whole as fighting for women. It's just that we fight for men as well. And our culture currently emphasizes women's issues so much that when a group stands up and represents both men and women in true egalitarian fashion, it looks like a men's movement. It's as if no one takes a moment to think that any movement that fights for equal human rights across the board, regardless of sex, is automatically standing for the rights of women too, right? They just don't exclusively stand for women. Feminism purports to do so, but it hasn't even done that. I see feminism, on the other hand, as anti-woman. It certainly gives women unfair advantages in the workplace and universities and whatnot. But it's also anti-woman in that it promotes a lifestyle that really tends to see or to leave women miserable and unfulfilled. We're seeing that more and more and more. Not to mention that it really only stands up for women who fit their ideology, who speak their narrative. So in reality, it is pro-feminist manifesto and not pro-women. Now, a word about the men's rights movement. An explanation of a few terms here first. The men's rights movement falls under the larger umbrella of anti-feminism, just as the organization A Voice for Men, for example, falls under the umbrella of the men's rights movement. Being an anti-feminism, or being an anti-feminist, opposing feminism, does not automatically make you a men's rights activist. Just as being a men's rights activist does not automatically mean that you endorse AVFM. So just to clarify, they're often linked, but not always, even though there's some overlap. So the men's rights movement has been brutally lambasted in the media. The organization A Voice for Men, for example, came under fire a few years back for their attention-grabbing headlines, many of which seemed very sexist, but were simply proving the point that if anyone treated females the way society is comfortable treating males, there would be outrage. And what people need to begin to realize at some point is the untold suffering that so many males do endure and the ways that men are now culturally and legally discriminated against. Family court injustice, gender quotas, we not only societally but systemically discriminate against males in ways that we indisputably do not discriminate against females. And I loved part of an interview with Paul Elam in Cassie J's Red Pill documentary, where he said, you know, people say, why are you so angry? And I say, why aren't you? You know? One of the most profound and poignant analogies I ever heard was by Karen Strawn. And some of you are going to find it crude, but I think the point is much greater than not offending people's sensibilities right now. She said it's like a man being repeatedly, over and over and over again, kicked in the nuts, and he takes it over and over and over and over again, and he's just sitting there in massive amounts of pain, not doing anything, and eventually he gets angry and yells, "Stop effing kicking me in the balls!" And the person kicking him responds, "Why are you so angry? What's your problem? You've got issues." And it's a perfect analogy because it is really in microcosm what is happening to men in our society. And first of all, not all the men in the men's rights movement are these angry men. They've been portrayed that way by the mainstream media, but they're not all like that. But second, if they are, they have every right to be. And yet even men's rights activists are not claiming that they are the only gender who's oppressed. They're not trying to take away women's rights. I read a YouTube comment that said it perfectly, and I quote, "The reason that the mainstream media portrays MRAs as though they are claiming that only men are oppressed is because they are so accustomed to presenting the issue as a zero-sum scenario in which only women are oppressed. They assume that the point being made by MRAs is the polar opposite of the ideology they represent. And so they assume that MRAs are making an argument as absurd and all-encompassing as the absurd and all-encompassing argument that they have been making for decades. There's this notion, too, among people unfamiliar with the reality that men deal with today, that this notion of balance, that you've got feminism over here and you've got the men's rights movement over here, and balance is right in the middle. Truth is in the middle. Who says that feminism and the men's rights movement are equidistant from the truth? They don't have to be, and they're not. Based on all the research I've done, they're not. Quoting another excellent YouTube comment, the reason that so many people believe so fervently in the feminist narrative and refuse to even consider that men have a side is because we have all been subjected to a several decades-long feminist propaganda campaign pushing only the women's side of every issue in the mainstream media, and more recently in college women's studies courses. Christina Hoff Sommers wrote in her book, Who Stole Feminism? She calls herself a classical feminist, by the way. She wrote about the distortions, exaggerations, and outright fabrications that feminists have spread in the mainstream media for decades that have gone unverified by journalists before publishing them. And the commenter continues, one was about the claim by feminists that a March of Dimes study showed the majority of birth defects were due to domestic violence by men against pregnant women. It was actually a total fabrication, as it turned out, by feminists. Christina Hoff Sommers contacted the March of Dimes, and they disavowed that they had any such study that showed any such thing. But the mainstream media picked it up. Of course they did, and spread it far and wide without the slightest verification by any journalist, and it became conventional wisdom that people just accepted without question. There have been plenty of other such claims by feminists over the decades that Christina Hoff Sommers researched, and she found them equally dubious and included them in her book. Mainstream media has massive influence over the way that most people think and what most people believe. We know this, and that's one of the reasons that it's so unbelievable to me, so funny but disturbing at the same time, that people talk about fake news as being anyone other than CNN, anyone other than mainstream media. Mainstream media is fake news. And of course that doesn't mean that any other form of news is real news, but you get my point. We ought to be doing our research. It is certainly worth noting that the men's rights movement of today does not exude misogyny in the way that the feminist movement did and still does exude misandry. The reason this is not apparent to everyone is that misandry has become so firmly embedded in the fabric of our culture. Think about it. It is perfectly socially acceptable for an exasperated woman to blurt out that she hates men or that men are stupid, right? I mean, this happens all the time. It's assumed that a man or men at large has wronged her in some way, and she's justified in the way that she's spewing. But if a man says he hates women, well, he's dangerous. And this is just talking about societal, cultural misandry, not the misandry that we've actually put into our laws, our workplaces, and our university curriculum. Even though I'm not able to get into it here because my video is already running long, I'll have to do videos later talking about the specifics of what I mean by this systemic discrimination. It is this marginalization and discrimination against males in our society which has birthed the men's rights movement. And it's a recognition of the damage done by feminism to our society at large, which has given rise to the growing anti-feminist movement. The funny thing is, most MRAs and anti-feminists aren't even traditionalists. Anti-feminism spans the entire political spectrum. And these are people who, even if they don't agree with traditional gender roles or complementarianism, at the very least are true egalitarians. And even as egalitarians, they recognize that males are under attack. You know that feminism has gone off the deep end and is breathing its last when even liberals see its hypocrisy, right? Cassie J, who's a liberal and once upon a time called herself a feminist, said that she called herself, I saw her in an interview, she said she called herself by these labels because she saw the left as advocating for being the advocates of free speech and science, until she was demonized by her own people for daring to even look into the men's rights movement by making the Red Pill documentary. People who wouldn't even have a conversation with her or see the film or take a look at the data called her a misogynist. So, this reality is what so many people are waking up to. So many women are turning their backs on feminism, and I think that's really great. Feminism is eating itself in many ways, and part of that is because we've finally been able to see the results of this enormous cultural experiment that we've done, and the results have not been pretty. So men and women alike are rejecting feminism. But I'll just say, if you don't know what anti-feminism is, or you're curious about what I or any other anti-feminist stands for, ask us. Have a conversation. It can't hurt to have a conversation. Don't assume that you know. Just like I don't assume when I'm talking to a feminist, I don't assume what they believe. I mean, I know what feminism's roots are, but I don't know what they personally believe. So it's important to have these conversations and hear one another in order to have understanding. Well, I hope you enjoyed that very, very brief and general overview. But as always, I love to hear your feedback, and thank you again for watching.